The coffee was cold by the time I understood what I'd missed. 52 years old, and I was sitting at my kitchen table at 6:47 a.m., staring at a series of emails I'd printed the night before, finally connecting dots that had been visible for months. The problem wasn't that the evidence wasn't there. The problem was that I'd been so desperately eager to believe she had my best interests at heart that I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. Victoria had always been that way with me, patient, supportive, the kind of woman who made you feel like your ambitions mattered because she paid such careful attention to them. I'd been married to her once briefly, before I understood what that attention actually cost. But this wasn't about the marriage. This was about something much larger, much more calculated, and infinitely more painful because it involved people I'd worked with for 15 years and systems I'd helped build from nothing. I hadn't slept. My chest felt tight in the way it always did now, a physical sensation that didn't come from anything specific, but from the accumulated weight of understanding that I'd been maneuvered, systematically and with remarkable precision, into exactly the position she wanted me in. What made it worse, what made my hands actually shake as I held those printed emails, was that I'd helped her do it. Every strategic decision I'd made, every relationship I'd carefully cultivated with board members, every presentation I delivered that made her look good had been assembling the very framework of my own professional elimination. The irony was so complete, so perfectly constructed, that if it were happening to someone else, I might have been able to appreciate the elegance of it, the careful patience, the year-long setup, the way she'd introduced just enough doubt into critical relationships to make everyone question my judgment without ever directly attacking me. My son had called the night before. Marcus was 28, living in Austin, and he'd been hearing the exhaustion in my voice for weeks now. He was smart enough not to push directly, but his questions came with a weight of genuine concern. "Dad, are you okay? You sound different." I told him what I always tell him, that work was intense, that I was just tired, that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. Everything was precisely the opposite of fine. But I couldn't explain that to my son because it would mean admitting that at 52 years old, I'd been outmaneuvered by a woman I'd once loved, a woman I still had to see almost every day at the office, a woman who smiled at me like nothing had changed every time we passed in the hallway. How do you tell your son that your boss, a woman who reported directly to you on the organizational chart, had spent the better part of 18 months systematically isolating you from the decision-making processes that defined your role? How do you explain that she'd done it so cleanly that if you complained to anyone, you sounded like a paranoid middle-aged man who couldn't accept changing dynamics? The morning light came through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything look slightly unreal. I was wearing the same clothes I'd worn yesterday. My hands, when I looked at them, seemed to belong to someone older than I felt. When had that happened? When had my hands started looking like my father's hands? I was somewhere in that strange temporal no man's land where you're old enough to feel genuinely vulnerable, but young enough to remember being invulnerable. 25 years ago, when I was building the original framework for the entire analytics division, I would have moved on this immediately. I would have gone to whoever controlled the board and presented evidence with the kind of contained rage that comes from perfect certainty. But now, at this age, with the particular weariness of a man who's watched too many corporate battles destroy people who didn't have the energy to recover from them, I sat with my cold coffee and tried to think clearly. Victoria had been hired as a senior analyst 5 years ago. At the time, I championed her hiring. She was brilliant, genuinely, undeniably brilliant. She had this way of seeing patterns in data that most people missed entirely, and she had the organizational instinct to translate those patterns into actual business value. I'd been hungry for that kind of intelligence around me, partly because I was tired of being the smartest person in most conversations, and partly because Victoria had this way of making you feel like she was grateful for the opportunity. She'd worked late. She'd attended the same conferences I attended. She'd asked intelligent questions in meetings and never made anyone feel stupid for missing what she'd caught. Over the course of 3 years, she'd become essentially invaluable. And somewhere in that transformation, she'd also become essential to my professional reputation. I started referring to her work in presentations. I started getting her involved in client meetings. I started, without quite realizing I was doing it, making her the public face of some of my most important initiatives. The first sign should have been 18 months ago when she was passed over for a promotion to VP of Operations. The role had gone to Thomas Chun instead, a solid manager who was competent but not exceptional. I remembered the conversation in my office afterward. Victoria had come to me and asked if I could explain the decision. Her voice had been steady, her expression professional, but I'd seen something flash across her face, something quick and cold. "They're worried about your timeline," I'd told her. "They think you're still developing as a strategic thinker. They want to see you in mid-level management for another year or two." It was the truth, as I understood it at the time. Victoria had nodded, thanked me for explaining, and left. Then she'd come back about 10 minutes later and asked if I'd be willing to serve as her mentor to help her prepare for the next promotion cycle. Of course I'd said yes. Of course I'd been honored to do it. That was when everything had actually started. I could see it now with the clarity that only comes from months of retrospective paranoia finally being validated by actual evidence. She'd asked to meet with me weekly. We'd have coffee on Tuesday mornings, not in the office, at a place 3 blocks away where people from our company rarely went. We'd talk about her development, about board dynamics, about how various executives in the organization thought about growth and expansion. The conversations had always felt open and collaborative. She'd ask me about my career progression, about what had taught me the most, about how I'd navigated the kind of political landscape that every mid-sized company develops over time. I'd answered honestly, probably too honestly. I'd told her about failed initiatives. I'd explained the specific ways that certain board members had tried to sideline me in the past and how I'd managed to rebuild trust after those situations. I'd even told her about specific incidents from my previous company, including details about a CEO who'd attempted to push me out through a quiet restructuring. And she'd listened to every word with an intensity that had made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. At 52, after a failed marriage, after a career spent mostly in competitive environments with colleagues who treated you as either threat or competition, that kind of focused attention had felt like a relief. She'd seemed genuinely interested in my perspective. She'd asked follow-up questions. She'd taken notes in a small notebook that she'd carried to our meetings. I'd interpreted that as professional respect. I'd felt like I was finally in a position where I could mentor someone, where my experience had actual value to someone who could use it. I'd felt useful. I'd felt like I was contributing to the development of the next generation of leaders. I'd felt, if I'm being honest with myself, like I mattered in a way that my day-to-day work had stopped making me feel like I mattered. The emails I'd printed out had been the first concrete evidence. They'd come from someone in IT, a guy named David who'd worked in the office about 15 years and who'd always been friendly but not particularly close to me. He'd sent them to my personal email account with a message. "Harrison, I thought you should see these. I've known you a long time, and this doesn't seem right." What didn't seem right was a string of communications between Victoria and Thomas Chun that I'd never seen before. They'd apparently been exchanging information about budget allocations for my division for nearly 6 months. Not major decisions. Nothing that would constitute a direct violation of protocol. But they'd been copying in Marcus Reynolds, who worked in finance, and the pattern of their communication suggested a level of coordination that circumvented my authority entirely. I'd called David and asked him why he'd felt comfortable sending those to me. "Because they're accessing your files," he'd said. "Not your personal files, but your project files. The ones locked at the divisional level." Victoria submitted a request for access about 4 months ago, said she was working on a cross-functional initiative with Thomas. I approved it because it seemed routine, but then I started noticing she was accessing them when you weren't in the office. Late at night, weekends. Not like normal collaborative access. More like she was going through things. I'd asked him if he could tell me specifically what she'd been accessing. He'd paused, and in that pause I'd heard the weight of his discomfort. "Honestly, I thought about this for a while before reaching out to you," he'd said. "But the kinds of files she's been in, they're your communications with the board, your performance metrics, your email correspondence about strategic initiatives, things that ... I don't know. Things that seem like they could be used to build a case against you if someone wanted to build a case." That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, I'd printed out everything I could access myself and had sat with it, trying to understand what the actual narrative was. Because that was the thing about being on the receiving end of workplace manipulation. It forced you to learn how to read situations differently, how to look at events you'd experienced as collaborative and recontextualize them as surveillance. That Tuesday morning meeting where Victoria had asked about board members who tried to push me out, that hadn't been her being interested in my experience. That had been intelligence gathering. She'd needed to know which board members might be skeptical of my continued value to the company. She'd needed to understand my vulnerabilities before she could effectively exploit them. The way she'd asked about my failed initiatives, she'd been cataloging my weaknesses, getting me to provide her with the ammunition she'd later use to slowly erase my credibility. I understood now that this had never been about her wanting to be mentored by me. It had been about her identifying that I was aging out of relevance in the way that men in their 50s often do. Still powerful enough to be a threat, but old enough that people start assuming your best years are behind you. The corporate world is brutal about that particular transition. You go from being a rising talent to being someone who might be ready to retire faster than seems possible. Victoria had probably identified that I was at exactly the right place in that trajectory. I was still effective enough that no one had started moving against me directly, but I was old enough that the narrative had already started to shift. I was the kind of executive that boards start to wonder about, is he still driving growth or is he just maintaining what's already been built? Is he an innovator or is he locked into patterns that worked 5 years ago? Is he someone who's going to be here for another 15 years, or is he getting ready for his exit? By identifying me as someone with these vulnerabilities, Victoria had positioned herself to become the solution to the problem I was starting to represent. If I was ineffective, then my replacement needed to be someone brilliant. If I was out of touch with current market dynamics, then Victoria, with her fresh perspective and her obvious intellectual gifts, was the natural succession candidate. She just had to create the evidence that would make that narrative stick. She'd had to make sure that I looked like I was losing my grip on the division. She'd had to construct situations where I would make decisions that could later be reframed as poor judgment. And she'd done it by using my own need to be relevant, my own hunger for intellectual validation, my own desperate desire at this point in my life to feel like I still had something valuable to offer. I went to the office that morning anyway, even though I wanted to call in sick. Calling in sick felt like giving her the kind of power I was determined not to grant her. If I was going to deal with this situation, I needed to deal with it from a position of relative strength. I needed to show up and look competent and present. I needed to make it clear through my actions that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The office felt different now. Everything did. The place where I'd spent most of my waking hours for the last 8 years suddenly seemed like a hostile environment, full of people who might be aware of what was happening or might be somehow complicit in it. I kept thinking about that line from Kurosawa films about how once you see something, you can't unsee it. I'd seen the architecture of Victoria's plan, and now every interaction with her, every email exchange, every meeting where her name came up or she presented work, I'd been involved with all of it registered as part of something larger and more calculated than I'd initially understood. My first meeting of the morning was with Thomas. He'd been promoted to VP about 6 months ago, and since then our working relationship had been strained in ways that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He was constantly checking in about my projects, asking questions that seemed more like audits than collaboration. He'd started requiring me to send him summaries of all client communications, citing the need for better coordination between divisions. In retrospect, he'd been gathering intelligence. He'd been building a map of everything I was working on, everyone I was connected to, every client relationship I maintained. He'd been, in effect, learning how to replace me. "Morning, Harrison," he'd said when I'd walked into his office. "I wanted to touch base about the Riverside account. Victoria's been doing some interesting analysis on their spend patterns. I think it might warrant a conversation about account management restructuring." There it was. The perfect example of how the machinery worked. Victoria does analysis. Thomas suggests it indicates a need for restructuring. Structuring that would presumably involve consolidating accounts that fell under my purview into a more integrated system, possibly under Victoria's direct management. "Send me what she's got," I'd said, keeping my voice level. "I'll review it before we discuss any restructuring." What I didn't say was that I'd already reviewed Victoria's analysis of the Riverside account and that I'd found it competent but not revolutionary. She'd missed several important context-specific factors that would have changed her recommendations. I'd almost mentioned it to her at the time, but hadn't, partly because I didn't want to undermine her work publicly and partly because I'd still, at that point, been operating on the assumption that we were collaboratively building something meaningful together. Now I understood that those missed factors weren't oversights. They were possible intentional gaps, designed to make her analysis look sufficient enough to justify future changes, but not so complete that it demonstrated true mastery of the account dynamics. "Also," Thomas had continued, "I wanted to give you a heads up that the board is discussing the future structure of analytics across the company. Some members feel like we might be able to generate more value if we consolidated some of the divisional functions. They're not talking about anything dramatic, but you should probably be prepared to discuss how your division might fit into a more integrated model." There it was. The actual narrative being constructed. My division was going to be consolidated. My authority would be distributed. Victoria would oversee what remained of analytical work within a larger structure, probably reporting directly to Thomas, which meant reporting away from me entirely. And the board members would feel like they'd made a strategic, data-driven decision rather than understanding that they'd been played by people who'd carefully manipulated the information they received. I'd left his office and gone to my own space, which looked exactly as it always had: clean desk, multiple monitors displaying various dashboards, a window that looked out onto the parking lot. I'd worked in this space for 6 years, and it had always felt like mine. Now it felt like a waiting room. I'd sat down and opened my email, and there was a message from Victoria asking if I had time for our Tuesday meeting this week. Tuesday meeting. The one that had started as mentorship and had actually been strategic intelligence gathering. She was still doing it. She was still going through the motions like nothing had changed. Like I didn't know what she'd been doing, like she was still the junior executive grateful for my guidance rather than someone actively working to make me obsolete. I'd sat there for a long time, staring at that email, trying to decide how to respond. I could confront her directly. I could go to the board. I could contact HR and file a formal complaint about the access to my files. I could do any of those things, and each of them would generate a specific set of consequences. Or I could continue to pretend that nothing was wrong, continue to meet with her every Tuesday, continue to let her ask me questions about board members and my vulnerabilities while I smiled and sipped cold coffee and pretended not to. Understand that I was being slowly erased by someone I'd tried to mentor. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my actual options were far more limited than I'd initially assumed. If I went to the board directly, I'd be framing Victoria as the threat, but she hadn't actually violated anything that would be obviously illegal or unethical. She'd accessed files she had authorization to access. She'd had conversations with colleagues about divisional structure. She'd offered her perspective on account management. None of it was actionable. In fact, if I tried to make it actionable, I'd look like a paranoid mid-aged executive who was uncomfortable with a younger, talented colleague's rising profile. I'd look exactly like the kind of person the board was already starting to wonder about. What Victoria had done was brilliant in its subtlety. She hadn't attacked me. She just made herself indispensable and made my role seem slightly redundant. She'd done it by understanding exactly where I was in my professional life cycle and what kind of vulnerabilities that trajectory created. She'd done it by weaponizing the very generosity I'd tried to show her. And she'd done it in a way that meant that if I tried to defend myself publicly, I would look like I was attacking a talented junior employee who'd been nothing but respectful and collaborative in every measurable way. The rest of the week passed in a kind of surreal normalcy. I attended meetings. I reviewed projects. I smiled at people in the hallway. I got lunch at my favorite place near the office, and I ran into David, who worked in IT. And he asked how I was doing, and I told him I was fine, and we both knew that wasn't true. On Tuesday morning, I met with Victoria at the coffee place where we always met. She was wearing a blue blouse that I'd seen her wear before, and she ordered her usual an oat milk latte, which I'd never quite understood, but which she ordered with a kind of precision that suggested it was important to her that they make it exactly right. We sat at a small table near the window, and I watched sunlight hit her face and make her look younger than she was, and I thought about how that was part of her strategy too. Everything about Victoria was calculated to present an image of someone rising, someone vital, someone who still had decades of possibility ahead of her, in stark contrast to my own presentation of someone trying to hold on to relevance. "How are you feeling?" she'd asked. "You seem quieter than usual." There was something in her voice, genuine concern or performance of genuine concern. I couldn't tell anymore. That was perhaps the most insidious thing about what she'd done. She'd poisoned the possibility of authentic interaction between us. Every expression of care might be genuine or might be part of the broader strategy. Every question might come from actual interest or might be intelligence gathering. There was no way to know, which meant that the person I tried to develop professionally had essentially disappeared and been replaced by someone I couldn't trust. "Work stress," I'd said. "The usual stuff." She'd nodded sympathetically, and then she'd asked me about board dynamics again. Different questions than before, but following the same pattern. She wanted to know about relationships that had recently shifted. She wanted to understand which board members were most invested in maintaining the current structure. She wanted to know which ones might be more open to strategic change. I'd answered as vaguely as I could, but I'd answered. Some part of me was still operating under the old framework, still under the assumption that she was asking because she cared about my perspective and not because she was mapping out which board members would be easiest to persuade that I needed to be reorganized. "I've been thinking a lot about the next phase of my career," she'd said as we were leaving the coffee shop. "I'm really grateful for everything you've done for me. You've taught me so much about how to think strategically." I'd smiled and told her that she had a bright future ahead of her, and she'd smiled back and thanked me, and we'd both walked back to the office pretending that we were exactly what we appeared to be, a mentor and a mentee with an uncomplicated relationship of growth and development. But underneath that surface interaction, something else was happening. Underneath it, there was the knowledge that she'd weaponized every piece of guidance I'd given her, that every strategic insight I'd shared had been recontextualized as intelligence about my own vulnerabilities. Underneath it, there was the cold precision of someone executing a plan that she'd probably started developing the moment she realized I was the kind of executive who would feel flattered to be asked for advice. The following week brought new evidence of what was happening. Rebecca Chun, who worked in the design division and had been a colleague of mine for 8 years, came to my office and closed the door. Rebecca was in her early 40s, and we'd built a kind of quiet friendship over the years based on mutual respect and occasional lunch conversations about the industry and other companies we'd worked for. She was smart and observant, and she had a habit of noticing things that other people missed. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something," she'd said, looking uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I overheard a conversation between Victoria and Thomas about the board's thinking on divisional structure. They were in the hallway, and I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard Victoria saying that she thought your division could be made more efficient if it were consolidated into a larger analytic structure that she would oversee." I'd thanked Rebecca for the warning, and she'd asked if I was okay, and I'd said I was fine. And then after she left, I'd sat at my desk for 40 minutes and tried to convince myself that everything I was feeling was a reasonable response to what I was learning rather than the paranoia of a middle-aged man losing his grip on reality. That's the thing about workplace betrayal that nobody really warns you about. It's not just the sense of personal violation. It's the way it recontextualizes everything you thought you knew about your own judgment. If Victoria had successfully fooled me for 18 months, how much else had I been wrong about? How many other people in my professional life were secretly working against me? How many other relationships that I thought were based on genuine connection were actually strategies? The paranoia doesn't just emerge in response to specific evidence. It starts to color every interaction, every email, every meeting. You start to wonder what ulterior motive lurks behind every word. You start to imagine conspiracy networks that probably don't exist. You start to lose the ability to trust your own reading of social situations. That Friday, I went home early and didn't mention it to anyone. I sat in my house with the lights off and thought about the trajectory that had brought me here. I'd spent 30 years building a career. I'd made good money. I'd been married and divorced. I'd raised a son who seemed to be turning into a genuinely decent human being despite having a father who was frequently emotionally unavailable due to work stress. I'd built something of professional significance. And now, at 52 years old, I was potentially watching all of it evaporate due to the careful manipulation of someone I'd tried to help. More than that, I was having to confront the possibility that the reason she'd been able to manipulate me so effectively was that I'd been vulnerable to exactly the kind of strategic flattery she'd provided. I'd been hungry for the experience of being useful to someone. I'd been eager to believe that I still had wisdom worth sharing. I'd been desperately willing to ignore warning signs because she was providing something I'd been missing in my professional life, the sense that I still mattered. That was the thing that kept me awake on Friday night. It wasn't just that Victoria had used me. It was that I'd made myself available to be used. I'd walked directly into her strategy because it had felt good to be valued. At a younger age, I probably would have recognized the dynamic faster. I probably would have been more suspicious of someone showing that much interest in my perspective. But vulnerability comes with age, and so does the desperate need to believe that you still have something to offer. Victoria had weaponized those vulnerabilities, which was brilliant and cruel and thoroughly effective. I called Marcus on Saturday. He was usually available in the early afternoon, and I caught him in between other activities. "Hey, Dad, what's going on?" His voice had that edge it always got when he was trying to figure out if something was wrong with me or if I was just calling to check in. "I'm fine," I'd said, even though I wasn't fine. "Just wanted to hear your voice." We'd talked for a while about his job, which involved software development for a healthcare company, and about his girlfriend, whom I'd never met, but who seemed to be approaching the status of something serious. He was trying to figure out if he should move in with her and was anxious about making the wrong decision. I'd told him that most major life decisions didn't have objectively right or wrong answers. They just had different consequences, and you had to be willing to accept whatever consequences came from your choice. He'd thanked me for the advice, which somehow made me feel worse rather than better. What right did I have to advise anyone about decision-making when I was clearly so poor at evaluating situations myself? Monday morning brought an email from the board. It was addressed to me and Thomas and Victoria and a few other senior leaders. It was calling for a meeting on Friday to discuss strategic restructuring. Within the analytics division, the language was careful and neutral, but the actual content was unmistakable. They were announcing that my division was going to be reorganized. They were giving me less than a week to prepare for a meeting where my role was probably going to be significantly diminished. The email had been copied to the entire senior leadership team, which meant that everyone already knew what was coming, which meant that Victoria's strategy had worked. I'd been successfully isolated and had my credibility questioned without anyone ever having to directly attack me. The narrative had simply shifted gradually until a significant restructuring seemed like a logical response to operational efficiency. I could still go to the board. I could still present them with evidence of Victoria's file access and Thomas's backdoor coordination. I could still make a case that this restructuring was not a strategic decision, but a political move orchestrated by people who'd been working against me. And if I did, what would happen? At best, I'd slow down the process. I'd force conversations about whether my accusation had merit. But in doing so, I'd look like a paranoid executive who was blaming his subordinates for his own declining value to the organization. I'd reinforce the narrative that I was out of touch, unable to accept challenge, unwilling to evolve. I'd essentially confirm the story that Victoria had been crafting all along, that I was someone who'd peaked professionally and was now struggling with the fact of my own obsolescence. The alternative was to accept the restructuring with grace. I could go into that Friday meeting and acknowledge that the organization needed to evolve. I could suggest that consolidating some analytical functions made sense strategically. I could recommend Victoria for the VP role that would likely emerge from this restructuring. I could position myself as someone who was evolved enough to understand that his time in the sun was over and who was willing to gracefully step aside for newer talent. In doing that, I'd preserve at least some of my professional reputation. I'd leave the organization without being forced out in a blaze of conflict. I'd be able to tell myself that I'd lost a battle, but that I was mature enough to accept it without bitterness. Except that wasn't who I was. Or maybe it was who I was becoming, and I wasn't ready to accept that yet. That Tuesday, I went to the coffee shop where I always met Victoria. She was already there, sitting at our usual table, her oat milk latte waiting in front of her. She smiled when she saw me, and for just a moment, I let myself imagine an alternative where she genuinely was just a talented junior employee who'd wanted mentorship from someone experienced. I let myself imagine that the evidence David had given me meant something different than I'd interpreted it to mean. I let myself imagine that there was a version of this situation where I could still trust her judgment. And then I sat down across from her and said, "I know what you've been doing." The change that came over her face was so quick that if I hadn't been looking directly at her, I might have missed it. For just a fraction of a second, the careful professional presentation slipped, and I saw something underneath it, something cold and calculating and utterly devoid of the warmth that had characterized our relationship. Then she recovered and the smile came back, but it was different now. It was the smile of someone who'd been caught and was deciding how to proceed. "I don't know what you mean," she'd said. Her voice was steady, but there was an undertone of something not quite fear, but certainly a recognition that the game had changed. "You've been accessing my files without legitimate reason. You've been coordinating with Thomas about divisional restructuring without including me. You've been gathering intelligence about my vulnerabilities by positioning yourself as my mentee. And you've been doing it all for 18 months with enough precision that if I tried to make an accusation, I'd look like a paranoid older man who couldn't accept that someone younger was outperforming him. I'd said it all very calmly, like I was discussing the weather rather than accusing her of a conspiracy that had been designed specifically to eliminate me from a position I'd spent 8 years building. Victoria had sat very still for a moment, and then she'd taken a sip of her coffee. When she set the cup back down, there was a small smile playing around the corners of her mouth. "Look, Harrison," she'd said, You're right that I've been working toward a restructuring, but that's not personal. That's just strategy. The division needed a change. You're a good manager, but you're not driving innovation the way the board wants. Victoria needs someone younger leading this kind of work. Someone with a more current perspective on analytics application. You can either accept that gracefully, or we can make this messy. But either way, it's happening. The casual cruelty of that assessment had actually been easier to bear than the deception had been. If she'd attacked me directly, I could have defended myself directly. If she'd told me 6 months ago that she thought I was out of date and that the division would be better served by different leadership, I could have engaged with that as a professional conversation. But the fact that she'd spent 18 months pretending to value my guidance while actually building a case against me, that was a violation of something more fundamental than professional protocol. That was a betrayal of the implicit contract that comes with offering genuine mentorship to someone. You're supposed to be able to trust that when someone asks you for guidance, they're actually interested in what you have to say rather than just gathering ammunition. I could go to the board with what I know, I'd said. I could make a case that this restructuring is politically motivated rather than strategically motivated. She'd laughed at that. Actual laughter, not angry or defensive, but genuinely amused. You could do that, she'd agreed. But what exactly would you tell them? That I accessed files I had authorization to access? That I talked to colleagues about the organization's future direction? That I asked you questions in coffee meetings that you interpreted as threatening? You'd look like a paranoid executive trying to block the rising star. And honestly, you'd probably be right about how it would play out. So unless you've got something more concrete than that, I'd suggest you start thinking about what your next chapter looks like. I'd left the coffee shop and gone back to the office. I'd gotten through the rest of the day by going through the motions. I'd attended meetings and reviewed reports and responded to emails. I'd performed competence while feeling like I was being erased from the inside out. That evening, I'd gone home and pulled out the photos from 25 years ago, from when I'd been in my 20s and the world had seemed full of possibility. I'd looked at pictures of myself at 30, confident and energetic and genuinely convinced that the best years of my life were still ahead of me. I'd looked at pictures from my wedding, where I'd been so sure that I'd made the right decision about partnership. I'd looked at a photo of me holding Marcus when he was newborn, and I'd felt the full weight of the fact that I'd never be able to get those moments back. Time was a one-way trajectory. You could regret decisions, but you couldn't undo them. You could recognize patterns that you'd been blind to, but that recognition didn't erase the time you'd spent being blind. Wednesday morning brought an email from HR. They were asking for a meeting on Thursday to discuss strategic reorganization and transition planning for the analytics division. The language was corporate neutral, but the actual implication was clear. They were going to inform me of the restructuring before the Friday board meeting. They were going to give me a chance to process it and potentially compose myself before I had to sit across from board members and pretend that I wasn't experiencing this as a professional death. I'd written back that I'd be available and then sat with that email for a long time, trying to figure out how I was supposed to respond to this with anything resembling grace. Thursday came and I sat in an HR office with Linda McKenzie, who was probably in her late 40s and who'd always struck me as competent but somewhat emotionless. She had a folder in front of her, and I could see that my name was written on the tab. She opened it and began reading from what was clearly a pre-written script. They were consolidating the analytics division with the operational strategy division, creating a new structure called Enterprise Analytics and Optimization. Victoria was being promoted to VP of that department. Thomas would serve as her director-level report, effectively maintaining his current authority while shifting slightly to focus on operational applications. My role was being repositioned to focus on strategic consulting within the new structure. What that actually meant was that I was being moved to a half-time advisory role. I was no longer going to have direct report authority. My compensation was going to be reduced by approximately 40%. and I would effectively be rendered obsolete within 6 months as the organization figured out that it didn't actually need someone in that advisory capacity. "We think this is a really positive move for you," Linda had said, reading from her script. "It'll free up your time to think about what your next phase might be, whether that's consulting, starting your own firm, or transitioning to another company. We'll provide a generous severance if you decide you want to pursue opportunities elsewhere." They were laying out a path for my exit. They were calling it a restructuring, but what they meant was that they were giving me the opportunity to resign with a severance package, rather than forcing me to stay on as a half-obsolete executive, gradually watching my authority drain away. It was almost kind in a way. If I took the severance, I could leave with my dignity relatively intact. I could tell people that I was moving on to new opportunities rather than that I'd been eliminated by a younger competitor. I'd asked Linda what would happen if I wanted to stay in the new structure. She'd shifted slightly in her chair, which indicated that this was the part of the script where she had to deliver information that wasn't quite as polished as the rest. "Honestly, Harrison, I'd recommend taking the severance. You're at a point in your career where you have options. A lot of people in your situation would prefer to have that clean break rather than staying on in a diminished capacity. But it's your choice." What she was actually saying was that if I stayed, I would be slowly marginalized until I either left on my own or the organization found a way to force me out that wouldn't involve additional severance. They were giving me the opportunity to make a strategic choice about my exit. They were, in effect, allowing me to preserve my own dignity by choosing to leave rather than forcing them to fire me. I'd asked for 24 hours to consider the offer. Linda had said that was fine, and I'd walked out of that office feeling like I'd just experienced something akin to a professional death sentence being gracefully explained to me. I'd gone through the motions of work for the rest of Thursday, and then Friday morning had arrived with the board meeting looming. I was supposed to sit in a room with 12 board members and participate in a conversation about the restructuring as if I just heard about it for the first time. I was supposed to express support for the new structure while watching my authority get systematically disassembled in real time. I didn't go to the meeting. Instead, I'd called Thomas's assistant and told her that I was sick and wouldn't be able to attend. It was a small act of rebellion, and it accomplished nothing except maybe to indicate to everyone that I wasn't going to participate in the theater of accepting my own professional diminishment with grace. I'd spent the day at home, and I'd called Marcus and told him that I'd probably be leaving my job over the next few weeks. He'd asked if I was okay, and I'd told him the truth, that I wasn't sure but that I would be eventually. He'd suggested that maybe this was an opportunity for something new, and I'd appreciated the effort to be encouraging, even though I wasn't really in a place to believe in opportunities right now. I was in a place of recognizing that I'd been outmaneuvered and that I had to decide whether to accept the severance and move on or to stay and fight a battle that I'd probably already lost. That Friday night, I'd made my decision. I was going to take the severance. I was going to resign. I was going to walk away from a job that I'd devoted 8 years to because staying would mean allowing myself to be gradually erased. And I'd reached an age where I was no longer willing to participate in my own erasure. But before I resigned, I was going to do something. I was going to go back and put together the evidence of what Victoria had actually done. And I was going to present it to the board in a way that made clear that this restructuring wasn't a strategic decision but a politically orchestrated move designed to eliminate a competitor. That Saturday morning, I'd gone back to the office. It was empty, just a few IT people and some security guards. I'd accessed the files with my credentials, and I'd printed out everything that seemed relevant. Communications between Victoria and Thomas about my division. Emails showing the coordination that had preceded the restructuring. The timestamps on Victoria's file access showing the pattern of when she'd been reviewing my materials. I'd spent 4 hours assembling a file that showed, with concrete evidence, exactly how the restructuring had been orchestrated. Then I'd left the office with that file under my arm and went home to figure out how to deploy it effectively. The problem was that I couldn't be sure that presenting this evidence would actually change anything. The board members had already signed off on the restructuring. They'd already bought into the narrative that Victoria had constructed. Even if I presented them with evidence that Victoria had been strategically gathering information and coordinating with Thomas to build a case for her own advancement, they might interpret that as just normal competitive dynamics in a corporate environment. She hadn't lied about my capabilities. She hadn't falsified my work. She'd just made a compelling case that the division would be better served by different leadership. That might technically be a result of political maneuvering, but it wasn't illegal and arguably wasn't even unethical. But there was something else in the file that I'd started to understand as I'd compiled it. There was evidence that Victoria had been accessing my communication with board members about strategic direction. There was evidence that she'd been presenting board members with information that she'd derived from my private strategic conversations with them. There was evidence that she'd been positioning herself as a conduit of information in a way that violated confidentiality protocols. That wasn't just competitive dynamics. That was a breach of fiduciary duty. That was something that a board actually had to care about because it exposed the organization to liability. I drafted a letter to the board chair. I'd kept it professional and calm. I'd presented the evidence in a straightforward manner. I'd explained that while I understood the strategic rationale for the restructuring, I believed the board should be aware of the process through which that restructuring had been orchestrated. I'd noted specific instances where confidential information had been shared inappropriately. I'd copied the entire board on the email and sent it Saturday evening. Then I'd waited. The response came Sunday morning. The board chair, Richard Summers, had called me directly. His voice sounded different than it usually did, more formal, less like the friendly colleague I'd worked with for 6 years. "Harrison, I've received your correspondence. I think we need to have a conversation before we proceed with any of this. I'm going to recommend that the board delay implementation of the restructuring pending an investigation into your allegations. But I want to be clear that whether or not those allegations hold up, your position in the organization has changed. The board isn't going to authorize you to return to your previous role. So whatever happens with this investigation, you need to understand that your future at the company is extremely limited. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, there was an internal investigation. It was conducted by an outside firm, and it was thorough. They interviewed David from IT. They reviewed access logs. They examined email trails. They talked to Thomas and Victoria separately. They talked to various board members about what information they'd shared with Victoria and when they'd shared it. And the investigation concluded that while Victoria had been engaged in sophisticated networking and information gathering, the way she'd done it had technically stayed within the boundaries of what was permissible in a corporate environment. She hadn't violated any explicit policies. The information she'd accessed had been available to her within her role. The communications she'd had with Thomas could be characterized as normal collaborative planning. However, the investigation also concluded that the restructuring should not proceed as originally planned because the process through which it had been developed raised sufficient governance concerns that the board needed to be more cautious about how it moved forward. What that actually meant was that Victoria wasn't going to get the promotion she'd orchestrated for herself because accepting that promotion would look like rewarding her for the politically manipulative behavior that the investigation had documented. Thomas wasn't going to get the expanded authority he'd been promised. And my position wasn't going to be restructured because that now looked like it was part of a political machination rather than a strategic decision. It was a Pyrrhic victory at best. I'd managed to prevent my own elimination by exposing the tactics that had been used against me. But in doing so, I'd also damaged the organization's ability to actually move forward with what might have been a strategically sound restructuring. Victoria wasn't going anywhere, but she wasn't advancing either. Thomas was in an awkward position. And I was left in a place where I retained my position and my authority, but I'd also revealed myself as someone who would go to war to protect his territory. I'd shown that I was willing to weaponize internal politics rather than gracefully accepting change. A week after the investigation concluded, Victoria resigned. She sent an email saying that she'd decided to pursue opportunities elsewhere and that she was grateful for her time at the company. She was leaving with professional dignity intact, and she was probably already in conversations with other organizations about where she could land. She'd failed in her attempt to push me out, but she'd also positioned herself to move on to something new where her obvious intelligence and strategic acumen would be better appreciated. She'd lost this particular battle, but she hadn't been fundamentally damaged by the loss because she was young enough and talented enough that there would be other opportunities. I, on the other hand, was left in a position where I'd won a battle, but where my position in the organization was fundamentally altered. I'd revealed myself as willing to engage in exactly the kind of internal political warfare that I'd told myself I was above. I'd had to dirty my hands to defend myself against someone who'd been willing to dirty theirs. And having done that, I couldn't pretend anymore that I was the kind of professional who stayed above that kind of thing. I was just someone old enough to know how to fight back and still young enough to be willing to do it. The other thing that happened as a result of all this was that my relationship with the board shifted. They appreciated that I'd been able to articulate what had happened clearly enough that they could act on it. But they also now understood that I was someone willing to use information as a weapon. They understood that I would escalate conflicts rather than resolve them quietly. They understood that I wasn't just going to accept organizational change, even if that change diminished my role. That knowledge changed how they interacted with me. I was no longer just the reliable administrator of the analytics division. I was someone who would fight. 3 months after Victoria left, I was offered a consulting position with a different company. It was at a senior level, and it paid well enough that I could consider it seriously. I'd taken the position. I'd spent 8 years building something at my previous company, and I'd spent the last few months of that journey recognizing that something I'd thought was based on merit and competence was actually based on a kind of fragile politics that was ultimately out of my control. I'd realized that the person I thought I was someone above petty corporate maneuvering was actually someone who was fully capable of engaging in that maneuvering when my position felt sufficiently threatened. I'd realized that the vulnerability I felt at 52 wasn't just in my mind. It was real. It was the vulnerability of someone who'd been successfully manipulated by someone younger and smarter about modern corporate dynamics than I'd given her credit for. It was the vulnerability of someone aging out of a particular kind of relevance. But it was also not the end of my story. I'd taken a new position, and I was working with organizations that were younger and more dynamic than the one I'd left. I was bringing the hard-won knowledge of what happens when you're not careful about the politics of your own position. I was also bringing something else, the understanding that the world was changing faster than I'd previously recognized, and that my job was to either evolve with it or accept that I was becoming increasingly irrelevant. What I realized months after all of this had happened was that Victoria's plan had worked exactly the way she'd intended. She'd wanted me to understand that I was vulnerable. She'd wanted me to recognize that my position was less secure than I'd believed it was. She'd wanted me to see that I could be outmaneuvered by someone younger and smarter about the specific ways that power operated in a modern organization. She'd achieved all of that. The fact that I'd managed to prevent her from entirely displacing me didn't change the fundamental lesson that she'd been trying to teach me. The fact that I'd exposed her strategy didn't erase the reality of what that strategy had revealed about me, that I was the kind of person who could be manipulated by flattery and attention, who could be made vulnerable by the simple act of being asked for my perspective as if it mattered. Now, at 52 years old, I lived with the knowledge of that vulnerability. I lived with the understanding that the confidence I'd carried through most of my career had been, to some degree, built on an outdated model of how organizations actually worked. I lived with the memory of how quickly that confidence could be undermined when someone younger understood the system better than I did. And I lived with the complicated feelings about Victoria herself, not quite admiration, but a reluctant recognition of her intelligence and the precision with which she'd executed a plan to advance her own position. The thing that I now understood, the thing that all this time I'd never realized she was planning from the start, was not just the specific mechanics of how to eliminate me from my position. It was something larger. She was planning to teach me a lesson about the arc of a career in a professional environment. She was planning to show me what happens when you age past a certain point and when your competitors understand the dynamics of power better than you do. She was planning to demonstrate that competence and loyalty and a genuine attempt to mentor someone meant nothing in the face of someone who is willing to be strategic about their own advancement. And she was planning to do all of that while remaining professional enough that I couldn't actually destroy her in response. In that sense, she'd succeeded more completely than I'd recognized even after I'd exposed her strategy. She'd changed how I understood my own position in the world. She'd changed how I understood the fragility of professional relationships. She'd changed how I understood my own vulnerability to manipulation. And she'd done all of that while maintaining enough professional distance that I couldn't definitively point to the moment when mentorship had transformed into something more predatory. Looking back on it now, I can see the architecture of it more clearly than I could when I was in the middle of it. I can see how she'd identified my vulnerabilities and had structured her approach specifically to exploit them. I can see how she'd used my own need to be relevant as a tool against me. I can see how she'd been patient enough to understand that the best strategy wasn't a direct attack, but rather a gradual accumulation of small advantages until the balance had shifted entirely. I can see that all this time, I never realized she was planning it from the start, which was perhaps the most important part of the entire lesson. What remains now is the question of what I do with that knowledge. I can't go back and undo the years I spent at my previous company. I can't recover the time I spent thinking that my mentorship of Victoria was building something meaningful when it was actually just providing her with the blueprint for how to navigate around me. I can't undo the damage to my reputation that came from having to defend my position so aggressively that I exposed myself as someone willing to weaponize information. What I can do is live with the understanding that came out of it. I can live with the knowledge that I'm no longer the person I thought I was, someone too smart to be manipulated, someone too experienced to be outmaneuvered, someone whose competence was sufficient protection against the kind of strategic maneuvering that happens constantly in professional environments. At 52 years old, I live with scars now. They're not visible scars. They don't show up on any kind of assessment or evaluation. But they're permanent. They're the scars of someone who's learned through direct personal experience that the professional world doesn't reward competence alone. It rewards competence combined with the ability to navigate the political dimensions of how organizations actually function. It rewards people who are willing to be strategic about their own advancement. And it particularly rewards people who understand how to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of people who are aging out of relevance. I could be angry about that. I could frame the entire experience as a betrayal by Victoria and a betrayal by an organization that prioritized aggressive self-advancement over loyalty. But the truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that I made choices. I chose to believe that I was above corporate politics. I chose to value mentorship and collaboration over strategic self-protection. I chose to assume that people were operating from good intentions rather than from strategic calculation. And in making those choices, I created a space where someone like Victoria could operate with remarkable effectiveness. Now, in this new position, I'm making different choices. I'm more careful about who I trust. I'm more aware of the ways that organizations reward strategic behavior and punish loyalty. I'm more conscious of the fact that my position is never as secure as I'd like to believe it is. I'm living with the knowledge that at 52 years old, With perhaps 15 good years of career left if I'm lucky, I'm still potentially vulnerable to being outmaneuvered by someone younger who understands the system better than I do. And I'm trying to figure out how to move forward with that knowledge without becoming so cynical that I lose the capacity to mentor other people or to believe in the possibility of genuine professional relationships. The last time I thought about Victoria, I'd heard through a mutual connection that she'd gotten a job at a much larger company in a VP level position. She'd landed on her feet. She'd survived the investigation into her tactics and had emerged with her professional trajectory intact. She'd failed to displace me, but she'd succeeded in advancing her own position through a different path than the one she'd originally planned. I found that I could feel something close to respect for her pragmatism, even while recognizing that what she'd done had caused me genuine damage. She'd done what she'd set out to do, which was to demonstrate that I was vulnerable and to position herself for advancement. The fact that she hadn't achieved it in the exact way she'd planned didn't diminish the fact that she'd achieved it eventually. What I was left with was the knowledge that all this time I never realized she was planning it from the start. I'd walked into her strategy with my eyes open, but my judgment compromised by my own need to feel valued. I'd provided her with everything she needed to understand how to move around me. I'd essentially handed her the blueprint for my own potential elimination. And while I'd managed to avoid that elimination, I couldn't manage to undo the lessons she'd taught me about the fragility of my position and the vulnerability that comes with aging in a profession that constantly privileges the young and adaptable. The question that I sit with now, in this new position in a new organization, is whether I've learned the right lessons from that experience. Have I learned how to protect myself without becoming someone so cynical that I can't form genuine professional relationships? Have I learned how to navigate the political dimensions of organizations without losing sight of the parts of this work that actually matter? Have I learned how to acknowledge my own vulnerabilities without becoming paralyzed by them? These are the questions that I don't have clean answers to yet. These are the questions that I'm still working through, still processing, still trying to figure out how to integrate into a revised understanding of who I am and what I'm capable of. All this time, I never realized she was planning it from the start. That understanding is the real inheritance of what happened. Not the specifics of what she did or how she did it, but the larger recognition that I'm someone who can be played, someone who can be manipulated, someone who, despite my age and my experience and my assumed sophistication, is fundamentally vulnerable to being outmaneuvered by someone younger who understands the system better. That's the knowledge I carry forward now, at 52 years old, into whatever comes next. That's the scar that doesn't show but is always there. A permanent reminder that vulnerability is not something you age out of. It simply takes different forms depending on where you are in your career and how desperate you are to believe that you still matter.